This is my next Math 229 review of section 4.2, looking at period change for sine x and cosine x. And yes, that's little Groot. Hello, little Groot. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to first talk about sine and cosine. So for sine, if you've watched my other videos, you know that where I always start is that sine goes 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. And the cut points are 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi halves, and 2 pi. All right. Cosine has the following that we start with. Cosine starts with 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. And it also has the same cut points of every pi halves. All right. So what the most important part I want you to get out of this is that this is where we always start. There are 5 cuts. Technically, to create these 5 points, we actually cut it 4 times because I'd go 1, 2, 3, 4. And because I start with 1 point and end with another, that's a total of 5 points. And the same is true about sine. So what we're interested in is what happens when the period changes if it doesn't go from 0 to 2 pi, instead it goes to something else. So the form of that equation is when you have a multiplication inside with the x. So here it'd be b times x. Now that b could be a 2. It could be a 4. It could be a fraction. Now that fraction could be off to the side, or they could also write this problem as x over 2. It would mean the same thing. For all of these, we have a b value. b is 2, b is 4, and of course b is a half. All right. So when you are trying to figure out what your new period will be, you first want to identify b. And then we're going to use the following formula. The period will be 2 pi divided by b. So what that means is that if you had the sine of 2x, since b is 2, the period would be 2 pi divided by 2, because b is 2. And 2 pi divided by 2 is just pi. So here, what's happened is that our original period was 2 pi. It's now shortened and completes one entire cycle in pi. All right. So basically, if b is a whole number, it's going to shrink or shorten our period. If b is a fraction that's less than 1, it will end up stretching the period. Okay. So step 1, basically, this process is to figure out what your period is. And we use our formula. Okay. Now, how would I graph this? Well, step 2 is, since we need 5 points, which means I would cut it in 4, we take our period, our new period, and you divide it by 4. So in this instance, I would take pi, divide it by 4, and that's what I get, is pi fourths. What this means is that when I go to make my chart, I'm not changing my y value, so it'll still be 0, 1, 0, negative 1, and 0. That hasn't changed in any way. However, instead of walking from 0 to pi halves, I'm now going to walk from 0 to pi fourths. Now walk an additional pi fourths. So to get to this spot, I would take pi fourths plus pi fourths, which is 2 pi fourths. Walk the next spot, add another pi fourths. 2 pi fourths and pi fourths is 3 pi fourths. And finally, to get to the next spot, add another pi fourths. 3 pi fourths and pi fourths is 4 pi fourths. Now some of you are probably going, hey Jen, isn't 2 pi fourths the same as pi halves? Yes, yes it is. And isn't 4 pi fourths the same as pi? Yes. So here's what's going to happen. We have that lovely chart. So now, if you wanted to graph it, we'd still have our value of 1 and negative 1. But instead of cutting it every pi halves, I'm going to cut it every pi fourths. So there's pi fourths, there's 2 pi fourths or pi halves, 3 pi fourths, and pi. So my 4 cuts, 5 points happen right here. And now I plot those y values and connect the dots. So there's an example of one whose period was shortened. Okay, let's do another example. And for this example, we'll do, how about we do cosine instead? And how about instead of having a big number, let's have a fraction. Like the cosine of a half x. So here what I have is that b is a half, which means that my period would be 2 pi divided by a half. That's my formula, 2 pi divided by b. 2 pi divided by half, the half will flip up. So that means my new period is 4 pi. So it's now being stretched instead of being shortened. To figure out the cuts, we take 4 pi and we divide it by 4. You're always dividing it by 4 to figure out the cuts. And here I have pi. So in the last problem, we cut every pi fourths. Now I'm going to cut every pi. So for this graph, when I make my table, for cosine, I always start with 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. 0 is where I'm starting in the x values, but I'm going to walk out now every pi. So if I add another pi, I get 2 pi. If I add another pi, I get 3 pi. And if I add another pi, it's 4 pi. So those are the points I want to graph. So let's go ahead and try it. All right, we're going to kind of stretch it out so you could really see it. So we'll call this pi, 2 pi, oop, I'm going to need to make it longer, 3 pi, 4 pi, and a value of 1 and negative 1. So here we go. 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. Connect those dots. Boom. And that's how you figure out your new period and how to graph it. Good luck.